If you only ever saw these classic movies as a kid, consider watching them again with more mature eyes. You're sure to catch some things that blew right by you the first time.
If you've ever tried to recreate the iconic lift from Dirty Dancing, you're not alone. Countless kids have collected bruises in pursuit of perfecting that classic moment between Baby and Johnny. However, considering the societal changes that have occurred since the film's debut in 1987, watching it today sheds some new light on the classic.
Nobody puts Baby in a corner.
Here are some things you only notice about Dirty Dancing as an adult. You might not remember Stan, the resort MC, but you'd probably recognize him now.
My God, it's Cleopatra. I feel like such an ass.
From Jurassic Park baddie to Jerry Seinfeld's arch-nemesis, Wayne Knight made a name for himself in the 90s, but he was still relatively unknown when he snagged this bit part in Dirty Dancing.
You know, I finally met a girl exactly like my mother. Dresses like her, acts like her, so I brought her home. My father doesn't like her.
Watching the film now, you almost expect Johnny to address Stan with a disgusted,
Hello, Newman.
And speaking of nostalgia, you might also recognize Baby's mother, Marjorie Houseman. She's much younger in Dirty Dancing, but actress Kelly Bishop has since brought to life another iconic matriarch, Emily Gilmore from Gilmore Girls.
Baby, stand up straight.
It makes sense that Bishop would be typecast as rich and privileged characters since she does it so well. When the Houseman family arrives at Kellerman's resort, they're approached by owner Max Kellerman and Billy, who presumably comes for their baggage. However, Billy can't seem to drag his eyes away from Lisa, Baby's sister. His face is so awkward that it makes you wonder if there wasn't something going on between the actors. However, Billy had more going for him than just a creepy look. While he may have been overshadowed by Patrick Swayze's Johnny, Billy was handsome, sweet, and had great chemistry with Baby. He took Baby seriously and never treated her like, well, a baby. Johnny may have the benefit of being played by Swayze, but he's dismissive and rude to Baby for a good half of the film. As you get older, you may find yourself appreciating a nice guy instead of a bad boy. However, just as Baby seems better suited to Billy, Johnny seems better suited to Penny, his dance partner and ex-girlfriend. Penny is everything that Baby is not: tall, mature, and most importantly, confident. As Baby starts to believe in herself, Johnny grows more attracted to her. But Penny has it all from day one. She's also fiercely protective of Johnny, while Johnny is tender and devoted to her. Billy assures Baby that Johnny and Penny are not together, but it's hard to believe when you see them on the dance floor. Swayze actually admitted in his memoir, The Time of My Life, that he felt strongly about Johnny and Penny, saying, "I felt all along that Johnny should ultimately end up with Penny, as they were so much alike and a more realistic couple than Johnny and Baby." When you think of a lakeside getaway, quaint images of rustic log cabins come to mind. That is, unless you're the Housemans. Dirty Dancing's Kellerman's Resort was not a real place, but it was inspired by the grand hotels of an area of the Catskills called the Borscht Belt. This was a popular vacation spot for wealthy Jewish families who wanted to escape from city life without losing their creature comforts of home. That is, until air travel became more accessible.
Trips to Europe, that's what the kids want.
The Houseman's cabin is roughly the size of a moderate suburban house and isn't cheap either. You can stay at the Mountain Lake Lodge where the Houseman stayed for $329 a night. While Dirty Dancing may have dropped the religious connotations, it maintained the divide between the vacationing families and Kellerman's employees, with integration being frowned upon.
No funny business, no conversations, and keep your hands off.
Johnny seems to be the only exception, giving secret private dance lessons to some wealthy female guests. Kellerman explains,
One of the bungalow bunnies. That's what we call the women who stay here all week long. The husbands only come up on weekends.
As if the financial divide wasn't emphasized enough, Vivian, one of Johnny's cougars, shrugs off her fur stole mid-dance and tosses it on the floor. This sort of disdain for material items is like a slap in the face to everyone who can't afford to dress themselves in furs. Coupled with the fact that Vivian ends up getting Johnny fired later in the film, it's easy to sympathize with Kellerman staff who have to put up with their privileged clientele. After hours of frustrating rehearsals in Johnny's studio, Johnny decides that a change of scenery is in order.
I'm doing all this to save your ass. What I really want to do is drop you on it.
Let's get out of here.
But instead of taking Baby somewhere easy to practice, like an open field, he takes her to the woods. Since Baby is still a beginner dancer, it makes perfect sense that Johnny would make her dance on a narrow log precariously balanced high above a ravine. Patrick Swayze knew better than anyone the perils of dancing on a log. The log balance dance aggravated a previous knee injury to the point where it almost derailed the iconic lift scene. Stick to the dance studio, kids. Grease is an iconic movie musical that is far better and more life-changing than it had any right to be. It's cheesy, silly, and still manages to resonate with audiences 40 years after its release. However, as with many classics, many dated moments didn't age quite as well as others. Here's all the things in Grease you only notice as an adult. If you thought everyone in this movie looked way too old to be in high school, that's because they were. John Travolta, who played Danny, was the youngest at 24. Olivia Newton-John, who played Sandy, was 30. And Stockard Channing, aka Rizzo, was 34.
I'm gonna get my kicks while I'm still young enough to get them.
With child labor laws to consider, it makes sense that Hollywood tends to cast older actors as teenagers. But Grease feels like it's pushing that just a bit too far.
Jan, that is so adolescent. We are adolescent.
Another overly mature aspect of this film? The dialogue.
I did meet this one chick. She was sort of cool. You know,
means she puts out?
Nearly every line is either an innuendo, a shameless flirtation, or dirty lyrics about a race car. Seriously, watch the Grease lightning scene again, but pay close attention to the lyrics. You'll be shocked your parents ever let you watch this when you were a kid. For many of us, high school was a nightmare, but Rydell High, the fictional school in Greece, seems like a haven. Aside from the massive carnival thrown to celebrate graduation, Rydell's staff goes above and beyond for their students. When Danny tries to get into sports to win Sandy's affection, Coach Calhoun refuses to give up on him despite his lack of talent. The shop teacher helps get Kanicki's car in gear even when there are stolen parts involved, and then shows up at the big race to cheer for the T-Birds. And who could forget Principal McGee and her hapless assistant Blanche sobbing as another senior class leaves the school.
Oh, Blanche, stop blubbering.
Played by Eve Arden and Dodie Goodman, this duo provides some of the biggest laughs of the film.
Blanche, do you have the new schedule?
Yes, Miss McKee. I just had my hands on them.
Oh, good. They'll be nice and smudged.
While most teen movies tend to drag in scenes when the grown-ups are involved, Grease gives two talented actresses time to shine. The older you get, the more you realize that Rizzo is actually the most sympathetic character in the whole movie. Compared to the other pink ladies, Rizzo is layered and nuanced. She's the only girl in Grease who gets to make mistakes and learn from them. She also gets the best songs. In a movie loaded with backward sexual politics, There Are Worse Things I Could Do was remarkably ahead of its time. On the surface, it's a heartbreaking and romantic ballad. But at its core, it's about a woman who is afraid to be vulnerable with a man because she's been hurt so many times before, and how she'd rather be called a tramp than actually admit that she cares. Unlike Sandy, Rizzo realizes she doesn't need to change anything about herself in order to be happy. Rock on! Many of the film's biggest moments take place at the Frosty Palace, a malt shop where kids in the 50s used to hang out. From Frenchie's divine intervention to Rizzo throwing a shake at Kanicki, this was the place to be. It's also the scene of a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment of hilarity when Rizzo strolls out of the ladies' room holding an ice cream cone. Rizzo clearly doesn't care what people think of her, but couldn't she have asked one of her pink ladies to hold her cone while she took a bathroom break? Marty is one of Grease's most underrated and hilarious characters.
Oh, double doodle! Please.
What's up, Doc?
One of my diamonds just fell in the macaroni.
Her big moment comes at the school dance when she sidles up to host Vince Fontaine. She laughs at his bad jokes and doesn't seem to mind that he's an older man. In short, she's smitten. We don't find out how their night actually went until Marty drops this bombshell at the drive-in.
I caught Vince Fontaine trying to put aspirin on my Coke at the dance.
Rizzo doesn't seem bothered that her friend almost got roofied, and it's unlikely that any of the kids watching this movie would have understood what Marty was talking about either. Yikes. If there's one talking point that's gained some serious traction since the movie's release, it's Sandy's infamous makeover. While some argue that Danny technically changed too, his so-called transformation pales in comparison to Sandy's.
Tell me about it, Stud.
It begs the question, should Danny and Sandy even be together? After one brief summer of happiness, they spend the entire movie at each other's throats. Eventually, Sandy perms her hair, wears some leather, and takes up smoking, and she and Danny ride away in their flying car. If you have to change who you are to get someone to like you, please reconsider. Danny and Sandy are doomed, and there's just no way around it.
Mary Poppins is one of the most beloved movies of all time, with charming characters and catchy musical numbers that have entertained generations of viewers. Don't get caught up in the nostalgia, though. If you rewatch it closely as an adult, you might be surprised to see that the movie is actually a little bit darker than you remember. Here are the things that only adults notice in Mary Poppins. Bert seems to be everywhere. We see him at the beginning of the film, performing as a one-man band for spare change, but he also has side hustles as a chimney sweep, sidewalk chalk artist, and kite salesman. When you watch this movie as a kid, you might envy Bert's nomadic lifestyle, but as an adult, he raises some questions. Is he just a free spirit who can't be shackled to a traditional job? Or is he taking on all this extra work because he's having trouble making ends meet? To a lot of us, Bert's an all too relatable character. Plenty of grown-ups know the struggle of living paycheck to paycheck and the hardship of trying to find gainful employment in a troubled economy. Still, whatever the reasons, you definitely have to admire his work ethic. On the one hand, Mrs. Banks is probably the most famous suffragette since Susan B. Anthony. It's admirable that she's seen marching for women's rights, especially since the movie was released in 1964, when the women's liberation movement was just getting started. On the other hand, she doesn't actually seem to follow through on any of her feminist principles.
I'd love to stay, but I have to dress for my rally in Hampstead.
Winifred, it is my wish that you be present.
Oh, yes, George, of course.
That admirable activism played for laughs, and we often see Mrs. Banks deferring to her husband, downplaying her own intelligence in order to appease him. She doesn't even seem to take an active role in raising her children, leaving Mr. Banks in charge of hiring nannies for Jane and Michael. Fortunately, the movie delivered a role model in Mary Poppins herself, but it seems like a missed opportunity to not have Mrs. Banks be a strong character too. This one is probably noticeable to children who grew up watching the movie in the United Kingdom, but for most American kids, Bert probably seems like a totally believable Englishman with a Cockney accent. Once you're an adult, however, you realize that no one in real life talks like Bert.
Beautiful, ain't it? A typical English countryside as done by a true and loving Anne.
Bert's horrendous accent has been one of the movie's most memorable flaws since its release, and even the actor who played him, Dick Van Dyke, acknowledges how awful it was. In 2017, he received BAFTA's Britannia Award and used his acceptance speech to apologize for what he called the most atrocious Cockney accent in the history of cinema. It's not all his fault, though. While Van Dyke is American, he said that none of the British people working on the film, including Julie Andrews, ever mentioned it, so he never realized just how terrible it was. As far as we know, Mary Poppins wasn't bitten by a radioactive nanny, and we don't think she put a spoonful of sugar into the super soldier serum, so where did she get her superpowers? Are magical nannies just a common thing in the world of the movie? Is Mary Poppins a witch? That might explain her clearly enchanted items like the bottomless carpet bag and the magical tape measure, and also why she doesn't seem to think that anything she's doing is out of the ordinary. It's actually a little frightening when you think about it. Mary worked her way into the Banks household by blowing away all the other applicants with a gust of wind. Just think of how much damage she could cause if she ever decided to use her powers for evil. To kids, Uncle Albert is a fun character, but we have a lot of questions. For starters, he seems to be well known to Mary and to Bert, but it's not clear if he actually is anyone's uncle. Even stranger, he suffers from a contagious affliction that causes him to float to the ceiling when he laughs too much, of which Mary does not approve. While his ailment is pretty comical to kids, adults can obviously see that Uncle Albert is actually a tragic character. He's very lonely, and when he's told that it's time for Mary and the kids to leave, he's completely crushed and reduced to tears. Also, is he actually anybody's uncle? There are a few scenes where we see that Mary Poppins isn't exactly the good-natured nanny she appears to be. She makes Uncle Albert cry and then leaves him depressed and sobbing on the floor. She also gaslights the kids when they attempt to reminisce over the wonderful day they had with Bert in a sidewalk picture. She acts like the adventure never took place and gets a bit aggressive when Jane tries to jar her memory.
A respectable person like me in a horse race? How dare you suggest such a thing?
When the kids continue to insist that they did indeed venture into a magical world where they participated in a horse race on carousel animals, Mary threatens to call the police if they don't stop talking about it, even if she's just doing it to prevent the kids from telling anyone about her magic powers. It's pretty cruel to act like they're delusional anytime they try to talk about it. That's messed up, Mary.
First of all, I would like to make one thing quite clear.
Yes?
I never explain anything.
Mr. Banks tries to show his children the world by bringing them to work with him at the bank, but he gets a little bit more than he bargained for. To call the bank's practices shady would be an understatement. Mr. Banks tries to convince Michael to open up a bank account rather than giving his money to less fortunate people, and his boss, the chairman, straight up commits a robbery. He demands that Michael invest his money and tries to grab it from his hands, not stopping even when Michael starts screaming. It goes without saying that this is a pretty terrible bank, and the customers who are present when Michael's practically mugged agree. They all demand to withdraw their money, sending the bank into a full-on riot and leading to Mr. Banks being fired. How many kids watching this movie grew up thinking that banks were terrifying creep factories out to steal all their cash? Good thing we don't have to worry about that in the real world. Mary Poppins is a film full of whimsical delights with singing, dancing, magic, and bright, colorful characters. For older eyes, however, it's easy to see that the London of the movie is actually pretty dismal. Everything there is dark and drab, and frankly, it looks like a terrifying place to raise a child. The glimpses we get of London look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland rather than a bustling city. If that's where they're growing up, it's no surprise that Jane and Michael often seem so unhappy. Thankfully, Mary was there to brighten things up a little, but what's going to happen to the kids when she's gone? How long can their happiness last without her? Will their dreary surroundings plunge them into an existential crisis without a magical nanny to lift their spirits? The star of Mary Poppins is, well, Mary Poppins, but let's be real. Bert is the true MVP. He's the one who suggests that a reluctant Mary take the kids on an adventure into a sidewalk chalk picture. And he's the one who drew it in the first place. Bert is also there when Jane and Michael meet Uncle Albert and laugh themselves into the air. He also brings the kids to the rooftops of London and even gets his fellow chimney sweeps to put on a show for them. Throughout the film, he's the one encouraging Mary to use her powers to entertain the children. And he's even the one who talks to Mr. Banks and makes him realize that he has emotionally neglected Jane and Michael for years. Thanks to their conversation, Mr. Banks becomes a better father and husband. We might even go as far as saying he's the real star here. Then again, the movie probably wouldn't have been as memorable if it was just called Bert. By the end of the movie, Mary Poppins has left, but it turns out to not be such a tragedy because Mr. Banks has been fired. That might not sound like good news, but because of his termination, he decides to finally spend time with his family. It's a heartwarming moment. As an adult, though, you might be a little worried about how the Banks family is going to make ends meet. Fortunately, we soon find out that Mr. Banks' boss is dead, and Mr. Banks is being rehired to take his place. The family's future is secured, and no more concern is necessary. Until you remember that Mr. Banks is actually responsible for his boss's untimely fate, since he passed on while laughing at a joke Mr. Banks told him.
Father! Father, come down! Daddy! Daddy, come back!
At least he went happy, but think of the lesson it teaches. Just remember, kids, don't laugh too hard, or else.
Almost every 80s kid will remember the Neverending Story. The fantasy epic centers on a young boy named Bastian who uncovers a world of luck dragons, rock biters, and a childlike empress in the pages of a novel, and turns to the next chapter of his own story as well. While that might sound fanciful enough, the film is actually pretty dark and twisty and filled with a running metaphor about grief and never giving up. Watching it as an adult is a whole different experience that reveals some interesting dynamics about the movie you might not have noticed in your youth. Here's what you'll only notice about the Neverending Story as an adult. There's no doubt that some of the characters in the Neverending Story are meant to be terrible. There are the Sphinxes who blew people up just for trying to cross their path without enough inner bravado. And let's not forget the wolf Gamork, who wants to dispense with Atreyu altogether so that the Nothing could destroy all of Fantasia. And that ageless turtle sure is a lazy sack of shell.
We don't even care whether or not we care.
But then there were also some characters that were supposed to be good, but actually come off a little creepy upon further review. Take, for example, that cranky bookseller who draws Bastian just a little too close for comfort while describing the forbidden book. Then there's Falcor, whose reaction to getting an ear scratch is pretty suggestive if you listen long enough.
Yeah.
The whole movie seems to center on Bastian's need to come to terms with his mother's passing. He's been suffering at school, he's not even trying to fight back against local bullies, and he's otherwise just having a tough time moving on. So when his dad confronts him about him slacking off at school, his reaction is understandable. He tells his father that he's still having dreams about his late mother, and instead of helping his young son process that grief, his dad basically tells him to suck it up.
We can't let Mom's death be an excuse for not getting the old job done, right?
That's some ace parenting, Dad. It's no wonder Bastian doesn't hesitate to hole up in the attic with just a school lunch and a book rather than go back home to that guy. As a kid, you probably caught the fact that there's a lot of sadness going around in the Neverending Story. After all, who wouldn't be bummed out by the scene where Artak surrenders to the sinking swamp? Which makes sense since it's literally called, well, the Swamp of Sadness. But for grown-up audiences, the harshness of these negative emotions is probably even more biting than it might be for a kid. For example, the despair is way too real for Morla, the Ancient One. The giant turtle is so old and tired of life that it's had to make up an alter ego just to have someone to talk to for the past 1,000 years. Then there's the bitter monologue that the rockbiter delivers after the Nothing snatches his friends out of Fantasia and into oblivion.
They look like big, good, strong hands.
Not only does he lament his own part in letting them down, but he decides to give up his own life to the stormy oblivion too, just because. Speaking of which, the Nothing itself is basically one giant metaphor for the non-existence of hope and imagination, and unlike most movies with happy endings, it largely decimates the entire otherworldly plane as we know it. That's a tough pill for anyone to swallow, no matter their age. But you won't fully comprehend just what the Nothing is until after you've filed a few tax returns and taken a look at your bank account. As if conquering bullies, his own grief, and a night in a dusty attic with just a sandwich and an apple isn't difficult enough, the task of saving Fantasia ultimately falls on Bastien too. He's told that he'll have to table his skepticism about the realness of the story and say, out loud, a new name for the childlike empress. In a dramatic moment, he leaps up from his seat on the floor of the attic, runs to the window, and mustering his best barbaric yawp, he shouts, in case you didn't catch that, he says Moonchild, which was his mother's name too. But there may be a reason it's so hard to distinguish what he says. Some theorize that his chosen name may have been purposefully obscured on screen to allow the film's young audience to imagine their own important name, in keeping with the story theme. Rumor has it, even the subtitles were left blank during that line just to keep those imaginations flowing.
Clueless is a mid-90s classic that had fans flocking to the stores for knee-highs and Mary Janes. The romantic comedy featured Alicia Silverstone as the ringleader of a quirky, girl-fronted clique where malls are as holy as church, and catchphrases are ordinary parlance.
Ugh, as if.
Nowadays, the movie stands out as a relic of the era for its clothes and slang, but there are still plenty of things that you'll only notice about the film by watching through a modern lens. Here's what you might not have noticed about Clueless before. Even though Cher might be a touch superficial, Clueless still passes the Bechdel test with flying colors. That means that at least 2 female characters in the movie with names talk to each other about something other than men, and it happens quite a bit in the movie. Cher talks to Miss Geist about grades and a disaster relief effort. Cher and Dion talk to Ty about getting a makeover and often talk about style and grades with each other as well. Then there's the scene where Cher and Ty make up after a fight. Considering how few movies actually meet this standard, Clueless was a bit ahead of its time, but there were also some aspects of the movie that are now pretty cringeworthy too. One of the more unpleasant things you notice about Clueless as an adult is how much of a dirtbag Murray really is, especially to Dion.
He is so possessive. Tell me about it.
Because of him, their relationship is unhealthy to the point of toxicity, even abuse. He pages her all the time, obsessively worried that she's jeeping on him when he's the one who's probably unfaithful.
Perhaps you can explain how this cheap Kmart hair extension got into the backseat of your car.
He also calls her woman repeatedly even though she hates it and constantly tells him to stop. Then he full-on blames her anger on her period, which is pure misogynist nonsense.
Is it that time of the month again?
Clearly he doesn't respect women, but Cher views it a little more simply.
I think they've seen that Ike and Tina Turner movie just too many times.
While Clueless was relatively progressive in that there was a fully developed gay character, there are some glaring LGBT stereotypes in the film. For example, Miss Stoger, the PE teacher, is portrayed as a man-hating butch gym instructor.
And in the grand tradition of PE teachers, Miss Stoger seemed to be same-sex oriented.
Cher is only able to get her to change her grade up by telling her that an evil male broke her heart. Miss Stoger responds sympathetically, calling men horrible and saying,
"Don't feel bad, I know, and you see they're all like this."
Then there's the issue of Christian, one of the major characters, who's a stereotypical gay man with his fashion sensibility, dancing skills, art literacy, and good physique. He's even shown reading a copy of Junkie by William Burroughs, a gay literary icon, in class. And although the movie's central cast is much more diverse than many of its contemporaries, Clueless still struggles with social gaffes. Consider the depiction of the Persian Mafia, a group of Iranian boys wearing dark clothing and sunglasses. Cher points them out to Ty by singling out their ethnicity. Then there's Lucy, Cher's maid. She is not well developed as a character, and what time is spent discussing her ethnicity only comes along as Cher mistakes her for Mexican when she's from El Salvador.
I'm not a Mexican.
She doesn't get many lines, and to make matters worse, Cher considers giving her secondhand expensive outfits as charity. Elton constantly ignores Cher's boundaries, literally grabbing and kissing her in the classroom not once, but twice. Then he deliberately drops the card when they play Suck and Blow in an attempt to kiss her. Later, while driving her home, he pulls over and tries to kiss her yet again. She pushes him off a few times before he gets the memo that she wants him to stop, and eventually has to get out of the vehicle to stop the harassment. Making matters worse, her punishment for thwarting an assault is being robbed at gunpoint. Another irksome element of the movie is how frequently Cher and her friends obsess about their bodies and how much they eat.
I had 2 bowls of Special K, 3 pieces of turkey bacon, a handful of popcorn, 5 peanut butter M&Ms, and like 3 pieces of licorice.
Then she laments that her PE class is hardly aerobically effective, and she also obsesses about food being fat-free, and tells Dion that if you cut your food into smaller pieces, it will help you lose more weight. Then she forces Ty to work out as a part of her makeover, until Ty issues a mea culpa and refuses to do any more activity. For extracurricular reading, she selects the title Fit or Fat. Finally, she says she feels like Ralphing because she had 2 mochachinos, which is hardly a binge worth lamenting. Her constant obsession with food is not healthy for her body or her mind.
16 Candles might be one of John Hughes' seminal cinematic classics, but that doesn't mean every aspect of the movie has aged well. In fact, there are a lot of scenes in the movie that are more likely to make you cringe than laugh. Sure, it was a product of the era, but some of the movie's moments of cultural insensitivity are just plain hard to overlook upon a modern review. Here are some moments from 16 Candles that will land a whole lot differently with modern movie audiences. One running theme of Sam's ill-fated 16th birthday is how often people make comments about her body. First, there's her brother, who pokes fun at her modest bra size.
Yeah, well, she's only eating carrots to increase the size of her breasts.
Then her own grandparents get a little carried away with the comments on her bosoms, or lack thereof.
I'd better go get my magnifying glass.
Oh, and they are so perky.
Grandma even cops a feel without permission.
Can't believe my grandmother actually felt me up.
Considering her whole family is more likely to make fun of her figure than wish her a happy birthday, it's no wonder Sam's so self-conscious. Of course, she's not so innocent herself. Sam and her best friend Randy stare down Caroline in the locker room and take their own shots at her for having such a developed figure.
Unbelievable. I swear to God, Caroline Mulford had to flunk about 9 grades.
Plenty of 80s movies deployed racist stereotypes, but 16 Candles might have most of them beat.
Are we still having dinner with the rice checks?
Riz checks.
The most blatant example of racism in the film is the depiction of foreign exchange student Long Duck Dong, who's basically a walking stereotype of Asian culture and whose name mention is usually accompanied by the sounding of a gong. It's pretty hard to make a person a full-on punchline, but here they have, and it's cultural awareness that takes a hit in the process.
The donga need food.
Meanwhile, the movie is also pretty offensive to members of the LGBTQ community, since even the good guy characters aren't hesitant to sling gay slurs at one another throughout the movie.
Just answer me one question. Yes, you're a total.
If there's one theme that seems to run strong throughout the film from start to finish, it's that the male characters in the movie are absolute cartoons of toxic masculinity. For example, Sam's younger brother kicks things off on a sour note by making fun of his sister's wedding day dilemma.
She got her period. Should make for an interesting honeymoon, huh?
Where are you learning that stuff?
School.
Good.
Of course, Mike isn't the only one who has terrible things to say about members of the opposite gender. Jay calls Sam a child because she's not an outright sex object. And then there's this.
Kids are looking at me a lot. It's kind of cool the way she's always looking at me.
Maybe she's retarded.
The film's resident nerd, Ted, constantly harasses Sam throughout the movie.
Come on, what's the problem here? I'm a boy. You're a girl. Is there anything wrong with me trying to put together some kind of relationship between us?
On the bus, in a car, wherever he can try to put the moves on her, he does, even if she makes it clear she's not interested. And what's even worse than that is the way Jake Ryan, the supposed dreamboat of the whole movie, treats the idea of assault against his girlfriend Caroline with such a blithe attitude.
I can get a piece of anytime I want. Got Caroline in the bedroom right now, passed out cold. I could violate her 10 different ways if I wanted to.
Not only does he give her the cold shoulder just because another girl has shown interest in him, but he even encourages the desperate freshman Ted to take her home because he's trying to step out on her with Sam and predicts she'll be too drunk to tell them apart anyway.
Jake, I'm only a freshman.
So? She's so blitz she won't know the difference.
So, yeah, he's basically setting his own girlfriend up to be molested in his dad's car, and we're supposed to think he's some great guy worth all of this trouble. Gross.
The Wizard of Oz is unquestionably one of the most influential films of all time, but there's so much more to this film than meets the eye. We guarantee that you'll see Dorothy and her friends in a whole new light when you watch the film again as an adult. In 2007, Time listed The Wizard of Oz's Wicked Witch of the West as one of cinema's all-time greatest villains. No surprises there. According to the publication, the Wicked Witch, Miss Gulch in her Sunflower State incarnation, was an out-of-the-closet sadist, ever threatening to set the Scarecrow on fire and plant a swarm of bees in the Tin Woodman's hollow chest. Played to perfection by Margaret Hamilton, there's no doubt that the Wicked Witch of the West is a quintessential baddie. That evil sneer, that frightfully green skin, oh, and that unmistakable cackle. However, as an adult, it's kinda hard to blame the Wicked Witch of the West for being so, well, wicked. After all, her sister, the Wicked Witch of the East, has just been killed in a tragic accident involving a flying farmhouse from Kansas. Talk about being at the wrong place at the wrong time. As if that wasn't bad enough, Glinda the Good Witch magically took the shoes from right off the dead witch's feet and gifted them to the girl who caused her death. Honestly, we'd be rather angry about all of this too. Without a doubt, Dorothy Gale is one of cinema's most memorable characters. And, of course, The Wizard of Oz would be nothing without Dorothy's beloved BFFs, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion. In addition to Dorothy and her gang, viewers are introduced to 3 witches throughout the course of the film. First, there's Glinda, otherwise known as the Good Witch of the North. Then there's the aforementioned Wicked Witch of the West. And as we just discussed, there's the ill-fated Wicked Witch of the East. May her wicked soul rest in peace. However, as adults, we can't help but notice something rather strange. Basically, one directionally named witch seems to be missing. Where exactly is the Good Witch of the South? She's nowhere to be found. In L. Frank Baum's children's novel The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the Good Witch of the North is the one who greets Dorothy when her house lands in Oz. But according to The Atlantic, Glinda the Good Witch comes from the South, and she doesn't even make an appearance until the second-to-last chapter. We imagine the film adaptation combined the Good Witches in order to streamline the storytelling process. Fair enough. Throughout her quest, Dorothy Gale makes friends with a brainless Scarecrow, a heartless Tin Man, and a conspicuously cowardly Lion, all of whom clearly bear a strong resemblance to the 3 farmhands who work for her Annie M and Uncle Henry way back in the brown land of Kansas. While Dorothy is often shown in palpable distress throughout the movie, she's far from your stereotypical damsel in distress. True, her 3 male cohorts do help her escape from the Wicked Witch's castle toward the very end of the film, but it's Dorothy who ultimately saves the Scarecrow's life and kills the evil witch. Not to mention, she bravely confronts the most powerful man in all of Oz after he tries taking advantage of her and her trusting, good-natured friends.
You're a very bad man.
Oh, no, my dear. I'm a very good man. I'm just a very bad wizard.
According to the New York Times, L. Frank Baum, author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was himself a feminist, once writing in a newspaper editorial that men who don't support feminist aspirations are selfish, opinionated, conceited, or unjust, and perhaps all 4 combined. Considering Dorothy was the brainchild of a feminist ally, it makes sense that she ultimately became the hero of her own story. Ever heard of imposter syndrome? Well, according to Harvard Business Review, imposter syndrome can be defined as a collection of feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. In other words, imposter syndrome is a seed of self-doubt that, once planted in your mind, can have you feeling a bit like a Scooby-Doo villain just waiting to be unmasked by those meddling kids. The titular wizard in The Wizard of Oz is a rather on-the-nose example of someone who suffers from imposter syndrome. After all, he spends his time posing as a powerful and intimidating being, until Toto pulls back the curtain to expose the wizard for who he really is.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain!
Once he's exposed, the fake wizard admits that he's just a man from Kansas who accepted the gig as Wizard of Oz after being swept away from his home by a cyclone. Despite being a so-called humbug, he's still willing to help Dorothy's pals by making them realize they already have everything they're looking for, namely a heart, a brain, and courage. In doing so, the wizard demonstrates that he is rather great and powerful because he helps others see their true worth, with no curtain or special effects required. In an attempt to prevent Dorothy and her friends from entering Emerald City and gaining access to the great and powerful Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch of the West conjures up an obstacle that's as dangerous as it is beautiful, a field of poppies. You know how that goes.
Poppies.
Of course, poppies are famously known for being a source of opium, which was once commonly used for pain relief and as a sleep aid. Upon entering the field of flowers, both Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion are lulled into a deep sleep by the poppies. But as we know, The Wizard of Oz ends with Dorothy waking up in her bed. She soon realizes all her adventures in Oz were but a dream she had. Being knocked unconscious in a tornado will do that to you. With that in mind, it's interesting to note that Dorothy's unconscious brain was able to imagine falling into a deep dreamlike state while already very much in a deep dreamlike state. Inception, anyone? When the Wicked Witch of the West uses her broomstick to set fire to the Scarecrow toward the end of the film, Dorothy acts fast, grabbing a bucket of rainwater and tossing it on her friend to extinguish the flames. However, a bit of water also splashes the Wicked Witch's face, causing her to melt right there on the spot. And as she's melting, the witch screeches,
What a world! What a world! Who would have thought a good little girl like you could destroy my beautiful wickedness?
Perhaps we're missing something here, but does the Wicked Witch even bathe? If this small splash can cause a full-on literal meltdown, that strongly suggests the Wicked Witch never washed her hands, took a bath, or got caught in an unexpected rainstorm. Was she even able to drink water? As we see it, the Wicked Witch must have been positively filthy and extremely dehydrated. What a world. Glinda the Good Witch is a major player in The Wizard of Oz. After all, she's the one who puts the ruby slippers on Dorothy's feet when the Kansas girl first arrives in Oz. And she's the one who wakes Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion from their poppy-induced sleep. Oh, and she's the one who ultimately helps Dorothy get back to Annie M and Uncle Henry by not so subtly telling her,
There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
However, Glinda doesn't seem to have a real-life counterpart, unlike all the other main characters that Dorothy meets in Oz. Obviously, the Wicked Witch of the West is the Oz equivalent of Elmira Gulch, and the Tin Man, Cowardly Lion, and Scarecrow are all representative of Dorothy's farmhand friends. Even Professor Marvel is part of Dorothy's Technicolor dream. He's none other than the Wizard of Oz himself. So it would kinda make sense for the Good Witch of the North to have been inspired by a real person from Dorothy's humdrum world. But if there is a Glinda-like character in Dorothy's real life, she's certainly never shown on screen. The question is why? Unfortunately, we may never know. Oh, and while we're on the subject of Glinda, there's something else we should point out. This so-called Good Witch might not be as good as we've been led to believe. Think about it. She lets Dorothy repeatedly put herself and her pals in harm's way, all while Dorothy is wearing teleportation devices on her feet. Why would she do that? And when the Scarecrow asks Glinda why she didn't tell Dorothy that she'd possessed the power to get back to Kansas all along, the Good Witch of the North airily responds,
Because she wouldn't have believed me. She had to learn it for herself.
Maybe we're reading way too much into this, but Glinda seems like the kind of witch who just sort of lives for drama, right? That would explain why she prefers to travel via pink magic bubble. Let's face it, even the most well-behaved dogs can act up once in a while, and unless you and your loyal companion are visiting a place specifically designed for off-leash dogs, it's probably best to use a leash, just in case your predictable pup springs for a moment of spontaneity. Dogs are notorious for their wild ways. One thing's for certain, Toto, Dorothy's almost obnoxiously adorable pooch, could have really benefited from a leash. Though undeniably cute as a button, Toto demonstrates that he's quite the little troublemaker in the film's very first scene. The Wizard of Oz opens with a shot of Toto giddily running down a dirt path alongside a very concerned-looking Dorothy. And why is Dorothy so worried? Well, Toto has just snapped and bit Elmira Gulch, the Kansas counterpart of the Wicked Witch of the West. Later, the nefarious Miss Gulch arrives at Annie M and Uncle Henry's house in a huff, demanding to have Toto put to sleep for what he did.
I'm taking him to the sheriff and make sure he's destroyed.
Luckily, the little pup was able to escape that grim fate. But really, a simple leash for Toto would have saved Dorothy a few tears. Even a rope would do the trick. It's a farm, they have to have a rope, right? If you're a woman, you know how hard it is to find clothing featuring real, honest-to-goodness pockets. It's a real problem. As Tanya Basu wrote in a fascinating piece for The Atlantic, women's slacks, dresses, and blazers often have no pockets, or worse, fake pockets that serve no utilitarian purpose besides leading the wearer on to believe they have a handy wardrobe aid until it's too late. The pocket problem is a real and pressing issue for women. That's why when we come across a cute dress with pockets, we want to shout our excitement from the rooftops. With that in mind, imagine our utter excitement upon spotting a pocket on Dorothy's famous blue and white gingham dress. Where on earth did she get that dress? Blink and you'll miss it, but remember the scene when Dorothy and the gang first meet the Cowardly Lion? Dorothy can be seen gingerly pulling a handkerchief from a discreet pocket at one point in order to comfort the wildly sobbing beast. According to NBC News, this secret pocket was sewn into a seam so that actress Judy Garland would have a convenient place to keep her cigarettes. So, now you know. Arguably, the most famous quote from The Wizard of Oz is Dorothy's line,
"There's no place like home."
But watching the film as an adult, this sentimental quip sounds like an alarmingly unadventurous PSA. Before she leaves Oz for Kansas, the Tin Man asks Dorothy what she's learned, to which she replies,
"If I ever go looking for my heart's desire again, I won't look any further than my own backyard."
And when she finally wakes up in the comfort of her own bed, Dorothy says,
"And I'm not going to leave here ever again, because I love you all."
Well, it sounds like the main takeaway from The Wizard of Oz is that young people should never venture further than their own backyard. Sorry, Dorothy, but that's just not a message that we can get behind.
The beach, motorcycles, leather jackets, and sunglasses, and of course, vampires. These are just a few of the pieces that make up the late 80s majesty of The Lost Boys. With an all-star cast, this teen horror thriller secured a permanent space in the Hall of Cult Classics. If it's been a long time since you've seen it, here are some things about The Lost Boys you only notice as an adult. Warning, spoilers ahead. It's pretty obvious to adults that The Lost Boys is based on Peter Pan. For one, the title itself refers to characters from the original play and subsequent adaptations. If you're a kid, though, you might not notice the connection because the director, Joel Schumacher, made changes to the screenplay to give it a more seductive tone. He told The Telegraph that he made the vampires older and more attractive in an effort to avoid making a, quote, "The Goonies Go Vampire" film. So while the Lost Boys of the film may be closer to men, they'll still never grow up or grow old. Back in the 80s, before Netflix, of course, you were at the mercy of your local video store, and to set up an account, you often had to provide a copy of your driver's license. That means the owner of the shop would have access to a lot of personal information, including where you live. So it's not surprising that Max chose that profession for himself as the perfect cover while targeting people. You might not put that together as a kid, but it's hard to miss as an adult.
I told you not to come in here anymore.
Studies suggest that 40 to 50% of American couples will go through a divorce in their lifetime. The Lost Boys realistically handles the subject in a subtle exchange between Lucy and her father when they first arrive in Santa Carla.
You're the only woman I ever knew didn't improve her situation by getting divorced.
But a big legal battle wasn't going to improve anybody's situation.
Lucy clearly isn't getting much support in the form of alimony, but she walked away just to have a clean break. It's addressed again when Max assures Sam that he's not trying to replace his father during the dinner scene. It's all handled in a very real, adult way. Michael may not be the villain in the film, but he certainly has a creepy streak. This is most evident in his pursuit of Star, who catches his attention while dancing during the iconic "I Still Believe" scene. He stares at her pointedly, not looking away until she acknowledges his gaze. When she eventually turns and leaves, he follows her out of the venue, and it's honestly really creepy. Don't take romance advice from 80s movies. The fictional city of Santa Carla is apparently quite white, as all of the lead actors in The Lost Boys are Caucasian. Some minorities were cast in smaller roles, which is evident during the People Are Strange montage. Additionally, the host who lets Lucy use the restaurant phone is black. But Santa Cruz, the city Santa Carla was based on, shows a little more diversity in the demographic data from the 1980s and 1990s than that, making a case for at least 20% of the population to be people of color. It's not surprising that this didn't happen, though, as Hollywood clearly has had a pretty severe diversity problem for a long time. In addition to a lack of racial equality, there's not a lot of gender diversity in the film either. Sure, it's called The Lost Boys, but in order for a movie to pass the Bechdel test, there are 3 criteria. 1, the film has to have at least 2 named women in it. 2, they must talk to each other. And 3, they have to talk about something besides a man. Unfortunately, The Lost Boys majorly fails. The 2 female lead actors, Lucy and Star, never have a conversation with each other. And since they never speak, the 3rd rule doesn't even apply. Some folks have argued that Lucy asks Star who she is at the end, but that's not what was said. She actually says,
"Who's this?"
Which is even worse. She asked the entire room instead of asking Star herself. David and the other vampires put Michael through a hazing so intense that it could qualify as a gang initiation. When the vampires descend on a group of surf Nazis and go on a bloody spree, Michael is expected to participate. Doing so would make him a full vampire, as well as an official member of their tribe. But Michael holds back, never fully joining the gang.
Feeding time! Come and get it, boys!
The Sound of Music boasts enduring appeal and definitive icon status as one of the greatest movie musicals of all time. But there are some moments you might have missed when you watched it as a kid that stand out much more in adulthood. The Sound of Music has one of the most iconic movie openings of all time. Whether you've seen the movie or not, you can probably visualize Julie Andrews launching into song with a spin atop the mountains of Salzburg, lifting the spirits of viewers the world over. As a kid, this moment was probably just a thrilling start to the movie. However, watching the film as an adult, you can't help but notice just how impressive the shot is from a practical standpoint. It turns out getting this legendary moment on camera was anything but easy. As Andrews explained in an interview with the American Film Institute, the cast and crew had, quote, terrible difficulty with the scene. Because we see Maria's spin from above, the crew actually filmed the scene from a helicopter, which flew at Andrews sideways, with a cameraman literally hanging out the door. The helicopter then turned around to repeat the shot, hitting Andrews with strong drafts that, quote, flattened her into the field.
It was fine for a couple of takes, but after that, you begin to get just a little bit angry and a little bit annoyed.
When Maria arrives at the Von Trapp mansion, she's greeted by the stern, cold-as-ice Captain Von Trapp. For kids watching the movie, he seems like the ultimate scary dad, but for adults, the captain comes across as more of a silver fox. As The Guardian noted at the film's 50th anniversary, Christopher Plummer's captain is among the sexiest military men anyone had ever seen in movies at the time. And as an Entertainment Weekly article about Plummer's performance noted, many fans still cite his performance as Captain Von Trapp among their first movie crushes, with very good reason. Even though Christopher Plummer himself had a somewhat difficult relationship with the character, once calling the Sound of Music, quote, an albatross around my neck, it's clear that he suited this stern but warm character perfectly. And older fans over the years have clearly noticed just how well he fills the captain's naval uniform. Captain Von Trapp's parenting skills almost certainly look a whole lot worse to adult viewers than what they remember from childhood viewings. As a kid, watching the captain treat his kids like members of a naval crew in The Sound of Music, barking orders at them, summoning them with a whistle, and forcing them to march around the house had a bizarre sort of logic to it. He was a grieving widow after all. Maybe imposing structure on his children was his way of coping with loss. However, through more mature eyes, this parenting is nothing but inexcusable, regardless of the captain's personal grief. And seeing the children's visible fear of their father at the beginning of the film adds a sad, even heartbreaking side to what was once a silly scene of kids marching. As Anne McLear of George Washington University pointed out in a 2002 NWSA journal piece, the captain's disciplinarian approach reflected a changing attitude towards gender roles. As McLear pointed out, it was up to Maria, the nanny, to help the father figure become softer and more domesticated with his children. That shift, according to McLear, reflected a very post-war American understanding of changes in family structure at the time the film was made. As children watching The Sound of Music, most of us probably missed some of the ominous scenes at the beginning of the movie. In one scene, Rolf, the postman and Liesel's secret boyfriend, exchanges a few words with the family's butler, Franz. As a kid, the moment comes across as a little dull. However, for adults, it's a sobering moment that foreshadows the political unrest to come. In the scene, Rolf and Franz discuss, quote, developments and movement, which for older viewers is a clear reference to the Nazi Party. In other words, he and the family butler are both pretty despicable characters right from the outset, even if the whole Von Trapp family doesn't know it yet. In fact, re-examining this brief scene sheds some light on why Franz is seen watching the Nazis intercept the family later in the film when they tried to escape the first time. Chances are he tipped them off. As kids, we probably didn't notice just how bad Rolf really was from the very beginning. As one viewer pointed out to NPR, Rolf first appears in the film as a romantic hero rather than as the bad guy, so it's no wonder we never really noticed it before. For children, the Sound of Music song 16 Going on 17 probably seems very grown up. After all, the idea of being a 16-year-old with a 17-year-old boyfriend probably seems a million miles away when you're a child. However, for adults, the song takes on a more sinister note. The song actually reveals the layers of oppression that young women like Liesel faced at the time. In fact, throughout the song, Rolf repeatedly explains how he intends to take control of Liesel's sexual awakening. The whole, quote, you need someone older and wiser line of thought is definitely a
little uncomfortable. Of course, as adults, we also see the irony in the song and in Rolf's overall treatment of Liesel. As The Guardian pointed out in a retrospective on the film, Rolf is barely an adult himself, and he's dumb enough to want to join the Nazis, so why does he get to be the one to tell the only slightly younger Liesel what to do? Whether you find the song uncomfortable or ironic, we definitely view this scene in a whole new light as adults. One of the most famous parts of The Sound of Music has to be the set of matching outfits that Maria makes out of her old curtains. The clothes serve as play clothes for the children to wear as they gallivant around Salzburg, learning to sing while the captain is away. For kids watching the movie, the curtain clothes serve merely as a visual indication of the kids' transformation into more fun-loving, easygoing children in Maria's hands. However, adults watching the scene almost certainly think of the sheer amount of work that would have gone into the clothes. After all, Maria makes 7 unique outfits by hand. This is one dedicated seamstress. Naturally, the curtain clothes became an iconic piece of cinematic costuming after the movie. As the Daily Mail reported in 2013, the outfits were so iconic that they were expected to sell at an auction for over $1 million. We've already mentioned that the late Christopher Plummer is something of a hunk in this movie, and when the romance between him and Julie Andrews really starts to get going, adult viewers certainly notice it. One of the key moments of sexual tension comes at the Von Trapp party when Maria and Captain Von Trapp dance together in the courtyard. For kids, the scene was probably just a little boring. However, for adults, the scene sizzles. Yes, while there are plenty of moments in the film for kids, this particular scene isn't for young viewers. It's for parents who understand the subtext of the dance, as it allows Captain Von Trapp and Maria to get a little intimate, despite being in public and in front of his own children. There's a lot going on beneath the surface of this socially acceptable act of closeness. The more we see of Uncle Max in The Sound of Music, the more we realize that his character is a little problematic. For kids, he comes across merely as the friendly uncle who helps the kids fulfill their dreams of singing on stage. For adults, Max's morals are thrown into question. Max is portrayed as being extremely self-interested, which becomes problematic when it comes to his approach to the threat of the Nazis in Austria. In one scene, Max flippantly says,
"What's going to happen is going to happen. Just make sure it doesn't happen to you."
As an adult, this moment jumps out, and Captain Von Trapp's angry reaction to it makes a lot of sense. It's clear that Max is the type of person to avoid standing up for his beliefs in favor of self-preservation, even when it comes to Nazi Germany. Max's live and let live attitude towards politics can be quite hard to watch in our modern context, when speaking up about your beliefs is arguably more important than ever. After the party where Maria and Captain Von Trapp share their steamy Austrian folk dance, the Baroness convinces Maria to run away. Maria returns to the Abbey where the Mother Abbess helps her to realize that her future lies outside of the Abbey walls. For kids, the scene is pretty straightforward. Maria has to go back to the Von Trapp family to embrace a new life and to follow her dreams and her heart. However, for older viewers, the scene is laced with more adult undertones. As NPR noted, Maria's decision in The Sound of Music isn't just about love, it's also about chastity. It's basically the Mother Abbess letting Maria know that maybe she's not cut out for vows of celibacy. As adults, we definitely see Maria's struggle in a new way. After all, her life as a nun would be very different, especially when it comes to the question of celibacy. For children watching The Sound of Music, Captain Von Trapp's fiancée, Baroness Schrader, comes across as the ultimate villain. Not only does she manipulate Maria into leaving the house, but she also threatens to ship the kids off to boarding school once she's tied the knot with the captain. But for adult viewers, the Baroness comes across in a brand new light. She is glamorous and stylish, and she's also incredibly mature. Plus, when she finally realizes that her fiancé is in love with Maria, she takes the classy way out rather than throwing a fit. In her understated, shockingly grown-up breakup with the captain, she even tries to make him feel better, saying,
"I really don't think you're the right man for me. You're much too independent."
We never realized it till now, but the Baroness is actually a pretty wonderful example of an independent, strong woman who refuses to settle with a man who won't give her everything she deserves. The wedding scene in The Sound of Music is pretty spectacular and romantic. With the gigantic cathedral, Maria's stylish gown, and the chiming bells, the scene initially seems to be nothing but the dazzling climax of the movie's romantic subplot. However, when you watch the movie as an adult, the ominous undertones of the scene become all too clear. As Maria and the captain kneel in front of the altar, the camera pans up towards the top of the cathedral for a startling transition. As Raymond Knapp pointed out in A Piece for American Music, there's a, quote, eerie moment of sound design that merges the joyous wedding bells with another set of bells, one's chiming to commemorate the Nazi regime's annexation of Austria. So this joyous moment is actually happening alongside a very dark day in European history. history. For kids watching the movie, the sight of soldiers marching through the streets is a little unsettling, but for adults, it's far more jarring. In the final scene of The Sound of Music, we are taken back to the hilltops of Austria as the Von Trapp family hikes their way across the border to the safety of Switzerland. The bird's-eye view of the family fleeing Nazi-controlled Austria has become an iconic image, and it's definitely a fitting way to end the film. However, for adult viewers, it does raise the question of how they got that far on foot. As it turns out, the hike would probably have been impossible. In fact, the real Von Trapp family who provided the inspiration for the film did not escape on foot, nor could they have, because the Swiss border is actually a 5-hour drive away from Salzburg. In the real story, according to the real Maria Von Trapp, the family simply got on a train.
The 1998 classic Practical Magic is the story of two sisters, Sally and Gillian Owens, played by Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, who come from a long line of witches. The film is a staple in the genre of 90s witch classics, and while many kids have watched the movie, there's a lot in the film that young viewers probably didn't notice. Everyone loves a cool aunt, especially one who will give you a ride to the mall and totally let you bum a cigarette. But Practical Magic made everyone wish they had an Aunt Frances and an Aunt Jet in their lives. From the moment Aunt Frances tells young Sally and Gillian,
"In this house, we have chocolate cake for breakfast,"
we knew these aunts were going to be the coolest. They're sassy, their outfits and hair can't be beat, and that margarita night is the epitome of cool aunt vibes. But don't let their positions as resident cool aunts make you forget about another super cool Practical Magic aunt, Gillian. Gillian is Sally's sister and her daughter's aunt, and she's wild and fun like any cool aunt should be. Sure, she may have been pretty absent from the girls' lives in the beginning, but her good times hanging out and partying by the pool just makes this cool aunt even cooler. In Practical Magic, Sally, spoiler alert, accidentally kills Gillian's boyfriend Jimmy by poisoning him with belladonna. Realizing what's happened, the sisters bring Jimmy back to life. Once alive, Jimmy tries to strangle Gillian, and Sally hits him over the head with a frying pan, killing him again. But the real trouble starts when Detective Gary Hallett shows up. He's looking for Jimmy, and Sally and Gillian can't explain why they have Jimmy's car or ring, though they scramble to keep what happened to Jimmy a secret. But what many viewers might not have realized is that the sisters could have cleared the whole thing up if they'd simply called the police after they killed Jimmy the second time. Since it was self-defense, we doubt Sally would have been arrested for this act. Sure, there might have also been a deadly amount of belladonna in Jimmy's system, but there probably wouldn't be a way to prove Gillian or Sally put the lethal dose in his drink. Practical Magic is filled with sadness, but what else would you expect from a movie in which one of the central issues is a family curse that kills loved ones? But Sally Owens seems to have the worst time of anyone in the movie. First, her parents die, and she and her sister Gillian are sent to live in a town where other kids bully them for being witches. Then her sister leaves in the middle of the night and doesn't come back until years later.
I feel like I'm never gonna see you again.
Of course you're gonna see me again. We're gonna grow old together. It's gonna be you and me. Living in a big house, these two old biddies with all these cats.
After that, her husband, whom she describes as a man she just can't stop kissing, dies tragically. Already her life seems to be falling apart when Gillian comes back into town, with a scary boyfriend, Jimmy, in tow. Sally has to protect her sister by killing Jimmy and covering up his murder, and in the process, watches Gillian almost die multiple times. And if that wasn't enough, she also has to deal with the conflicting and painful feelings of wanting to be with Gary Hallett and the fear that her love could literally kill him. Basically, Sally Owens needs a hug. One great thing about Practical Magic is that it features so many strong women. While young viewers might not have registered the major feminist vibes, it's clear to adults that this movie made sure to include strong female characters. Sally Owens is strong as hell, running a business and keeping things together at home after her husband dies. Meanwhile, Aunt Frances and Aunt Jet are full of wisdom and confidence. And Gillian is a feminist icon with her sexually progressive attitude. But that's not all, folks. At the end of the movie, all the women in the town come together to banish Jimmy's spirit from Gillian in an epic exorcism. Though some of these townswomen weren't supportive of Sally and Gillian before, in the end, they do the right thing and come together to help the sisters out. This film is filled with strong women who get things done and support one another. When Gary Hallett first shows up to investigate missing person Jimmy in Practical Magic, Sally is worried. She tells Jillian,
"There's a cop downstairs and he's looking for Jimmy and he wants to talk to you, and I think I'm having a heart attack."
And Sally is worried for good reason. She killed Jimmy twice, and she and Jillian buried his body in their yard. If Hallett were to find Jimmy's body, Sally and Jillian could be arrested and sent to prison. Yikes! Luckily, Hallett is the worst investigator ever. Not only does he spend all his time reading and rereading Sally's letter to Jillian about how she wants someone to love her, which, for the record, contains no evidence related to Jimmy's disappearance at all, but then he makes out with his lead suspect. In the end, he claims Jimmy's death was accidental, so that ultimately he and Sally could get together. While Practical Magic might be a pretty great movie, the ending is pretty, well, iffy. Sure, it concludes with a happy ending. Jillian doesn't have an evil spirit living inside her. Sally finds love, and the town is nicer to the Owens family. But there's something that just doesn't make any sense. During Jillian's exorcism, there's a burst of light, and the face of Maria, the sister's ancestor who started the family curse, can be seen. This is presumably meant to suggest that perhaps their magic was so powerful that it ended the curse. And indeed, it seems that Sally thinks the curse has ended because, in the last scene, when she and her family prepare to gently descend after jumping from the roof, she muses,
"Was it our joined hands that finally lifted Maria's curse? I'd like to think so."
Plus, since Gary Hallett is there watching them fly, he clearly hasn't died yet, so the curse might just be lifted. But it took Michael, Sally's first husband, years to be struck down by the curse. How does Sally know the curse was lifted? And why would joining hands and banishing a spirit have anything to do with the curse? It just doesn't make sense.